I survived 76 days alone on a raft in the Atlantic Ocean. Stephen Callahan had always been a man of the sea. An experienced sailor, boat designer, and adventurer, he'd spent years mastering the unpredictable moods of the ocean. In January 1982, at age 30, he set sail from the Canary Islands aboard his custom-built sloop, the Napoleon Solo, heading toward the Caribbean. It was supposed to be a triumphant solo crossing, a test of his skills and the seaworthiness of his own design. For the first week, everything went according to plan. The winds were favorable, the weather clear, and Stephen felt the familiar comfort of being alone with the waves, the stars, and the endless horizon. He'd done this before. He knew the risks. But the ocean has a way of humbling even the most experienced sailors. On the 7th night, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, Stephen was jolted awake by a massive impact. The Napoleon Solo shuddered violently, throwing him against the cabin wall. His heart hammered as he scrambled to his feet, trying to understand what had happened. Had he hit something? A whale? Debris? The answer didn't matter. Water was already pouring into the cabin at an alarming rate. Stephen worked frantically in the darkness, trying to locate the breach, trying to pump out the water, but it was hopeless. The hull had been catastrophically damaged. The boat was going down, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. With minutes to spare, Stephen grabbed what he could: his emergency duffel bag, some navigation equipment, a spear gun, and his inflatable life raft. He barely had time to deploy the raft before the Napoleon Solo disappeared beneath the black water, taking with it almost everything he owned, everything he'd worked for, and his only means of salvation. And just like that, Stephen Callahan found himself adrift in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, floating on a 5.5-foot inflatable raft designed for coastal emergencies, not long-term survival. The first morning brought a terrible clarity. As the sun rose, Stephen took stock of his situation. He had a rubber raft called the Rubber Ducky 3, a small survival kit containing a solar still for making fresh water, a few cans of food, some flares, a sleeping bag, and a spear gun with a handful of spare rubbers. He also had basic navigation tools, a sextant, charts, and a compass. It wasn't much. The emergency rations would last maybe a week if he stretched them. After that, he would have to survive on whatever he could catch from the ocean. He calculated his position as best he could, roughly 800 miles from the nearest land. Even if he could somehow drift toward the Caribbean, it would take weeks, maybe months, depending on the currents. Stephen wasn't naive. He knew the statistics. Most people lost at sea died within the first few days, from exposure, dehydration, or despair. Those who lasted longer often went mad before their bodies gave out. But Stephen had one critical advantage: he refused to accept defeat. He established a routine immediately. Every morning, he would check the raft for leaks, inventory his supplies, and take a sun sight with his sextant to track his position. He rationed his food carefully, allowing himself only a few sips of water and a tiny portion of canned food each day. He talked to himself constantly, narrating his actions like a documentary, keeping his mind sharp and focused. But the ocean was relentless. The raft, designed for short-term use, began to deteriorate almost immediately. The sun's UV rays made the rubber brittle. The constant saltwater exposure caused seams to weaken. And worst of all, the creatures beneath the surface started to take notice. Stephen first noticed the sharks on day 4. At first, they were just shadows, dark shapes gliding beneath the translucent floor of his raft. Curious, cautious. But as the days passed, they became bolder. The sharks weren't the massive great whites of Hollywood movies. Most were Dorados and oceanic whitetips, ranging from 6 to 10 feet long. But size didn't matter when you were floating on a piece of rubber thinner than a sleeping bag. One serious bite, one determined attack, and Stephen would be in the water with them, and that would be the end. The attacks started small. A bump here, a testing bite there. Stephen would feel the raft shudder as a shark investigated the strange floating object. He learned to stay perfectly still during these moments, barely breathing, praying the rubber would hold. Then came the night he would never forget. He was half asleep, exhausted from another day of fighting dehydration and hunger, when he felt a massive impact from below. The raft lifted clear out of the water, and Stephen was thrown against the side. He scrambled to grab his flashlight and shone it over the edge. A huge shark, at least 12 feet long, was circling his raft, its dorsal fin cutting through the moonlit water. It had bitten into the lower tube, and Stephen could hear the air hissing out. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced himself to think. He grabbed his repair kit and worked in the darkness, his hands shaking, patching the hole while the shark continued to circle. It took him 3 hours to complete the repair and reinflate the chamber using the manual pump. By the time he finished, his arms were trembling with exhaustion, and the sun was beginning to rise. The shark was gone, but Stephen knew it would be back. They always came back. From that point on, Stephen barely slept. He would doze for minutes at a time, jerking awake at every sound, every movement in the water. The constant stress began to take its toll on his body and mind. By the end of the second week, Stephen's emergency rations were gone. If he was going to survive, he needed to become a hunter. The problem was that he'd never speared a fish from a drifting raft in the middle of the ocean. Coastal fishing was one thing. You had stable footing, clear water, and abundant targets. Out here, the water was thousands of feet deep, and the fish were fast, wary, and often dangerous. Stephen started with the Dorados, beautiful, iridescent fish that were attracted to floating objects. They would gather beneath his raft, feeding on the smaller fish and barnacles that collected on the underwater portion of the raft. They were fast, but Stephen was patient. He would spend hours lying perfectly still, his spear gun aimed, waiting for the perfect shot. His first successful kill felt like a miracle. The spear struck true, and Stephen hauled the thrashing fish into the raft. It was only about 2 pounds, but it represented hope. He used a small knife to gut and fillet the fish, eating some raw and drying the rest in the sun for later. The Dorados became his primary food source, but they were unpredictable. Some days, he would catch 2 or 3. Other days, they would vanish entirely, leaving him weak and dizzy from hunger. He learned to use every part of the fish, eating the organs for nutrients, using the bones and guts as bait for smaller fish, even sucking moisture from the eyes when his water supply ran low. But fishing came with risks. Blood in the water attracted sharks. More than once, Stephen watched helplessly as a shark stole his catch right off his spear. And occasionally, he would hook something too large to handle, a fish that would nearly pull him out of the raft before he was forced to cut the line. Food was a challenge, but water was a matter of life and death. Stephen's solar still, a device that used sunlight to evaporate seawater and collect the condensation as freshwater, was his lifeline. But it was painfully slow, producing only about a pint of water per day under ideal conditions. And conditions were rarely ideal. On cloudy days, the still produced almost nothing. Stephen learned to spread out plastic sheets and any fabric he had during rainstorms, desperately collecting every drop of rainwater he could. He would wring out his sleeping bag, lick moisture from the raft's canopy, and when things got truly desperate, he would carefully sip small amounts of fluid from the fish he caught. Dehydration became his constant companion. His tongue swelled, his lips cracked and bled, and his urine turned dark and concentrated. There were days when he was so weak that he could barely lift the spear gun. His mind would drift, and he would hallucinate, seeing islands on the horizon that didn't exist, hearing voices calling to him from the waves. But Stephen developed a strategy to combat the madness. He talked to himself constantly, describing everything he was doing in minute detail. Now I'm checking the solar still. The collection bag has about 2 ounces. Not enough, but it's something. I'll ration it carefully. 1 sip now, 1 sip in 4 hours. The sound of his own voice kept him grounded in reality. He also kept a detailed log, scratching marks on a piece of waterproof paper to track the days, recording his position, his catches, and his thoughts. Writing forced his brain to organize information logically, fighting against the cognitive decline that solitude and starvation brought. Stephen knew that his only chance of rescue was to guide his raft toward a shipping lane or inhabited land. Using his sextant and charts, he calculated his position each day, tracking his slow drift across the ocean. The currents were carrying him generally westward, toward the Caribbean, but the progress was agonizingly slow, sometimes less than 20 miles per day. He had no way to steer the raft directly, but he could influence his direction slightly by deploying a makeshift sea anchor or adjusting his body weight. Every decision mattered. Drifting too far north might take him into the empty waters between Bermuda and the Azores, a maritime desert where he could float for months without seeing another soul. Too far south, and he might miss the Caribbean islands entirely. Stephen spent hours each night studying the stars, using them to confirm his position and maintain his bearing. The stars became his companions, constant, reliable, unchanging. When everything else was chaos, the stars reminded him that the universe had order, that he wasn't completely lost. He also kept a count of ships. By his calculations, he should have been passing through areas with at least occasional cargo ship traffic. He prepared flares and a signaling mirror, keeping them ready at all times. But day after day, the horizon remained empty. No ships, no planes, no rescue. The isolation was crushing. Stephen began to understand how people lost at sea went insane. The human mind wasn't designed for such complete solitude, for a world where the only sounds were wind and waves, where the only sights were water and sky. He found himself having conversations with the fish, with the raft, even with the sharks. Anything to hear a voice, even if it was his own. By day 40, Stephen had lost nearly 40 pounds. His body was consuming itself, burning through muscle and fat to keep his vital organs functioning. His skin was covered in sores that wouldn't heal, and his joints ached constantly. The slightest movement required tremendous effort. But the physical deterioration was nothing compared to the psychological toll. There were moments when Stephen seriously considered ending it, just slipping over the side of the raft and letting the ocean take him. It would be peaceful, he told himself. No more pain, no more fear, no more endless days of suffering. What kept him alive during those dark moments was a combination of stubbornness and imagination. He would visualize his rescue in elaborate detail. The sight of land, the sound of human voices, the feeling of solid ground beneath his feet. He would imagine the meals he would eat, the shower he would take, the people he would tell about his ordeal. He also made a promise to himself. If he died out here, it would be because the ocean killed him, not because he gave up. Every morning, he would repeat a simple mantra. Today, I survive. Tomorrow, I'll worry about tomorrow. And somehow, impossibly, he kept going. As Stephen entered his 11th week adrift, his body was failing. He could no longer stand without feeling dizzy. His vision was blurring. His hands shook constantly. He knew, with a cold certainty, that he was running out of time. But his navigation calculations showed something promising. He was approaching the Caribbean archipelago. If the currents held, if his estimates were correct, he should be nearing the shipping lanes around Guadeloupe and Marie-Galante. Stephen prepared himself for one final push. He checked and rechecked his signaling equipment. He forced himself to stay alert during daylight hours, scanning the horizon constantly. He couldn't afford to miss his chance. On day 75, he thought he saw something on the horizon. At first, he dismissed it as another hallucination. His mind had played this trick on him dozens of times before. But this time, the shape didn't vanish. It grew larger. It was land. Stephen's hands trembled as he raised his signaling mirror, flashing it toward the distant shore. But the land was still miles away, and his raft was barely moving. Night fell before he could get close enough to signal anyone. He didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. He was so close. On the morning of day 76, Stephen spotted a small fishing boat in the distance. With the last of his strength, he fired a flare into the sky. The bright red signal arced through the air, and Stephen watched, his heart pounding, as the boat changed course and began heading toward him. When the fishermen pulled alongside his raft, they found a man who looked more dead than alive, skeletal, covered in sores, barely conscious. They later said they could hardly believe anyone could survive so long in such conditions. Stephen Callahan had drifted over 1,800 nautical miles across the Atlantic Ocean. He had survived 76 days on a raft designed for a few days of emergency use. He had fought off sharks, starvation, dehydration, and despair. And he had won. The fishermen were from Marie-Galante in the French West Indies. They gave Stephen water, food, and medical attention, then transported him to a hospital. His recovery took months. His body was severely damaged: malnutrition, dehydration, exposure, and multiple infections. But his mind, miraculously, remained sharp. Stephen's survival became legendary in maritime circles. He later wrote a book about his experience, Adrift, 76 Days Lost at Sea, which became a best-selling account of human endurance. His survival techniques have been studied and incorporated into modern maritime safety training. When asked how he survived, Stephen always gave the same answer: "I refused to let the ocean win. Every day, I made the choice to live." That's all survival really is, making that choice over and over, until rescue comes or you can't make it anymore. I just made it long enough. What would you do if you were stranded alone in the middle of the ocean? Could you survive even 1 week on a tiny raft with sharks circling below? Stephen Callahan's story proves that the human will to survive is stronger than almost anything nature can throw at us. If this story inspired you or blew your mind, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible true survival stories. Drop a comment below telling me, what's the longest you think you could survive adrift at sea? Would it be days? Weeks? Or would you find a way to last as long as Stephen did? Let me know. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss our next video. Thanks for watching, survivors. Stay strong out there.